In this recording, I'm going to talk about the 4 mechanisms that can lead to microevolution. And remember, that just means the changes in allele frequency in a population. One mechanism is called natural selection, which you're probably very familiar with at this point. And I want to point out that natural selection is the only mechanism that leads to what we're going to call adaptive evolution. And by adaptive, I mean that the population becomes better adapted, and by that I mean better suited to the environment. That works by the differential survival and reproductive success. So differential meaning some individuals survive and reproduce more successfully than other individuals, and remember, reproduction is necessary because the alleles need to be passed on more or less frequently to the next generation. So this is not a random process. Remember, the mutations that arise or the genetic differences that arise are random. Which phenotypes survive and reproduce better is not random, that's environment dependent. When we talk about survival of the fittest, a lot of people have a misconception that that means the strongest or the fastest or even the most fertile. But really, in the end, it has to be 2 things. One, that they reproduce the most often, which means that they're passing those alleles on to the next generation more frequently than other phenotypes and thus genotypes. Secondly, though, it can't just be about reproduction. The organism's offspring have to be viable, which means that they're living and healthy and alive. So if an organism's offspring never make it to term, they die in utero or in the egg or whatever, then that would not be a fit organism. And they also have to be fertile, which means they can make offspring. And not just any, but they can make viable, fertile offspring as well. And that's because for the alleles to shift, there has to be generation after generation after generation of that selection to get the microevolution to occur. When we look at natural selection, we think about 3 different ways the population can be altered. So here is a phenotypic trait. You can see the 2 extreme phenotypes and a middle phenotype. Now, not everything is going to have a spread out phenotype, but this curve idea is the same. And then we have frequency of that phenotype. So you can see we start with the population with a high frequency of the middle phenotype and lower frequencies of the extreme phenotypes. And here we have 3 fitness scenarios. So which one is in place, of course, depends on the environment. Fitness means most surviving and reproducing. And here's the phenotypes on this axis again. So the phenotype that's in the middle has the highest fitness and the extremes have the lower fitness. In this case, one of the extremes has high fitness, the other extreme has low fitness, and in between has in-between fitness. And in this case, your middle phenotype has very low fitness compared to your extreme phenotypes. Think about what the curve, this curve here, would look like after multiple generations, and take a moment to sketch that for each of these 3 scenarios. Okay, so here are the resulting populations. When the middle phenotype is fittest, you expect the curve to narrow around that phenotype. So we call that stabilizing selection because the phenotype is being stabilized in the middle. When there's selection for one extreme and against the other extreme, we expect the curve to shift towards the fitter phenotype. And so we call that directional selection. It could go either way. And then this is called disruptive selection, where your middle phenotype is less fit, so you expect it to be less frequently seen, and so you get this sort of M-shaped curve. And you'll notice as well that it actually spreads out wider, and that's because those extremes on the phenotypes are more successful than the middle. And so try to think of some diverse scenarios in which you'd see each of these selection results. The second type of mechanism that leads to microevolution is sort of a subsection of natural selection, but because it's so different and not necessarily obviously adaptive, I'm going to count it as separate. So We call it sexual selection here, and that basically means non-random mating, which means that Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is not in existence, and that's why microevolution is occurring. And what we mean by sexual selection is that some individuals have traits which make them more likely to acquire mates. One way this can happen is intrasexual selection. So intra means within, like an intrastate is just in one state. So this is fighting in many cases, or it's competition between the same sex organisms. So here's two males that are competing for access to females. Intersexual selection, like an interstate is between states, is between the sexes. So this is where the female typically is choosing the mate. And a lot of times, particularly in birds, this leads to very, very elaborate, colorful type male birds and not female birds. And we call that sexual dimorphism, where the male and the female look very different. A lot of times that's because of sexual selection. So here is the peacock, a classic example, and a peahen. And the peahens select males a lot of times with the showiest feathers, which shifts that population towards showy feathered males. That selection is not present in females because they are the ones doing the choosing. In fact, it's probably more advantageous for females to blend in with the environment so they can take care of their chicks and increase the survival rate of that next generation. Another example of birds that I really like are these birds of paradise. So if you are interested, definitely check this website out. It's amazing. So here's an example of one type of bird of paradise. And you can see it's doing this really interesting wing display, call it shape shifting. The females are choosy about who's the best shapeshifter in the population, and that male would get mated with more. And remember, this is all within the same population, which means the same species. Another amazing example of female choosiness and males evolving very elaborate behaviors are the bowerbirds. So some bowerbirds make these huge, called bowers, and then they decorate them. Different ones decorate differently. There's many species of bowerbirds, but you can see that there are different decorations, and females are choosy depending on that decor. There's also bowerbirds that make these littler bowers, and they do these dances. The best dancer is going to get mated with more often, and males also can bring gifts there as well, sometimes of particular colors. And then this is another bird of paradise here, and you can see this male is doing a very elaborate display, feather display and dance, and he has his colors going. And so that's another example of the male showiness, and the males that are showy in the best way are the ones that get more females in that population. And it's not always feathers, so here's an example of a frog. The male frogs in a population can have slightly different calls, so frequency of their mating call and or pattern. And so females sometimes choose certain patterns over others consistently. And so those males that have that pattern or that frequency would get mated with more often. And thus they pass their alleles on to the next generation more frequently. And then that results in more males having that type of call phenotype because it gets selected for. So why would this have evolved? One idea, and that's been supported by data, is called the good gene hypothesis. So the idea there is that the males that have the favorable trait are actually better at making viable, fertile offspring. So these gray tree frogs, the females prefer the long call. They did experiments where they used males with short calls and males with long calls. And what they saw is that the long call, which is the favored phenotype by the females, had better survival, and then the next year had better larval growth. And then also in both years had shorter time to metamorphosis. So it seems to suggest that the males with the long call also have genes that are probably linked that result in more viable fertile offspring. You could also think about this maybe with showy colors, is that a lot of times those colors require certain foods to get the pigments for those colors. They can't, like birds can't make them themselves. And so the brightest males may be the best at getting food, which means that they have some other sorts of genes that make them better at surviving and thus reproducing. And so it's favorable for the females to choose those. Now they don't know that. They're just choosing probably on the brightness. But the ones that chose on the brightness also chose for this successful survival food acquiring allele. And so that propagated that choosing, because the females who have the genetic tendency to choose the bright males also end up choosing the males that are successful for surviving, reproducing, and making fertile, viable offspring. The third mechanism that causes microevolution is called genetic drift. So in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, one thing that cannot be operating is that there's a small population. And this is the consequence of a small population, genetic drift. The key here is that it's chance events. So it's some random event that results in a shift in the alleles. So what that means is that you are not necessarily getting adaptive features in the population. One example here is we call it sampling error. So basically this means that even though with these crosses of these beetles, you'd expect 75% of the alleles to be green, 25% of the alleles to be brown, just because of the fact that the mating doesn't work out 100% divided equally, you get in the next generation allele shift in the population. And that's not because of selection or anything like that. It's just because this population is small and the random sampling error has an impact. So the way I think about this is flipping a coin. So if you flip a coin 10 times, technically you're expecting 5 heads, 5 tails. A lot of times you're not getting 5 and 5. You're getting, 6 and 4, 7 and 3. That's sampling error. Because if you increase the amount of flips like to 1,000,000 times, you're really expecting very close to 500,000 of each heads and tails. So in a very large population, having 3 more or 3 less than expected doesn't make a big impact on the frequencies of alleles, but in a small population, having 3 more or 3 less than expected does. So what can happen here is that you could get a population better adapted to the environment, but you can also get a population less well adapted. And so you could even see an increase in the frequency of harmful alleles just by the small population random events. You also may see rare advantageous alleles lost because they just don't get crossed like you'd expect. There are also events that are not the sampling error, but they are random events. We also count those as genetic drift. One is called bottleneck effect. So a bottleneck means that only a small portion of the population survives. So usually this is something here, like where the beetles get stomped on by a person. It's not that the green ones are any better suited to the environment. In this case, it's just because the person randomly stomps on some beetles. It happens to be more of the green ones. Now your population has a much lower frequency of the green allele than the brown allele, and so it's undergone microevolution. There's also what we call the founder effect. So in this case, you're looking at a large population, and then you have some small population break off, and the large population has some frequency distribution of alleles, but because there's only a small group that breaks off, you may not get that frequency of alleles. So for example, if you looked at our class and our class went and colonized Mars, and then we wanted to look at allele frequencies that we bring to Mars, they're not going to model the population of the United States. So when we create a new colony there, those frequencies of alleles would shift. And so that would have been the founder effect, which is a genetic drift type of microevolution mechanism. And you see this very frequently in island populations, as well as small groups like the Afrikaner population in South Africa, and Mennonites, Old World Amish, I believe. And they have small groups that have settled new areas. And so those new populations are different than the population. Let's say the Netherlands, the Dutch population is going to be different than the Afrikaner population. And in fact, they have high frequencies of diseases there because the frequency of that disease allele was very high because there were so few people that moved to this new population. And in this case, this is why small populations are concerned in conservation, because the less genetic diversity there is, the less likely the population can respond to environmental changes successfully. Here's an interesting and useful concept map. So you could recreate this or your own version of microevolution and make sure that you can fill in the parts here. You can create a concept map in any sort of way. It doesn't have to be like this. But basically, you're trying to tie all the ideas of microevolution together in one graphic form. The fourth mechanism that can lead to shifts in allele frequency is gene flow. And so this means that individuals, like a beetle here, or you could have just gametes, like pollen, carry sperm. So those are basically going into or out of the population. So if you have these beetles come in, they bring their alleles with them, the population shifts in allele frequency. If you were to have these two beetles leave the population, then automatically the allele frequency shifts. And if you have gene flow, you have two populations, and you have a lot of gene flow between those populations, their allele frequencies are going to be more and more similar over time because of the alleles being traded between those two groups. In this case, you see it's sort of random which individuals end up moving into or out of the population, and so this is not necessarily adaptive. So sometimes people think, well, all diseases should be gone because natural selection should select against all of them, and I don't see that happening, so what's going on? And so I want to explain some reasons why unfavorable genotypes are not automatically eliminated and natural selection still is occurring. So one is diploidy. Now, not all organisms are diploid in all states of life. But for those who are, remember that means it has two copies of every allele. If there's complete dominance in the scenario here, your recessive allele phenotype doesn't show up. So if most of the population is, let's say, the big A allele, you will mostly make big A babies, but every once in a while you have this little a allele. In that case, you're still going to make offspring without the detrimental phenotype, but every once in a while you'll have rare individuals that are both heterozygous come together, and you'd expect a quarter of those offspring to be homozygous recessive, which would cause the disease. So because the alleles are very infrequent and because they are phenotypically covered up by the complete dominant allele, that means that this little a allele could stay in the population at higher amounts than you'd expect, because it's very infrequent that you get the offspring where that allele causes it to die. We also have late onset disease phenotypes. What I mean by that is mating has occurred prior to the disease manifesting and killing the organism. So for example, Huntington disease. We see that in higher frequency than you'd expect because it doesn't onset until later in life after the children have already been produced. And so that means that you could pass that Huntington allele on, even though it's a dominant allele. In other words, it does not decrease the reproductive success of the individuals. And then we have what we're calling balancing selection, where multiple phenotypes are selected for in the population. One reason that could be is what we call heterozygote advantage. This is the sickle cell disease story with sickle cell trait, sickle cell disease, and non-sickle cell. So the sickle cell trait has one of each allele. The A allele for the hemoglobin is the functional allele. The S results in that protein that's misshapen that forms those crystals. The book has a very good explanation of that, and we also have a video to watch about it. What this means, though, is that they have a slight sickle cell trait, we call it. So they have some consequences of sickle cell heterozygotes, but in areas with high malaria, they're protected against malaria because the sickle cell allele and having half of their hemoglobin misshapen actually prevents the malaria parasite. So this is a red blood cell. The malaria parasite is called Plasmodium. It's a protist. It lives inside those red blood cells, but when the red blood cells are those sickle shape, Plasmodium can't live in there. And so the SS individuals die from sickle cell, especially in populations without modern medical treatment. The AA individuals, the HBA, are going to die more frequently from malaria. But the heterozygotes have the advantage because they are not so sick from their sickle cell allele, but they are protected against malaria. So you'd have a higher frequency of the sickle cell allele, even though it's not seemingly advantageous, because it's advantageous in the heterozygote. Another balancing selection is what we call frequency-dependent selection. And so what this means is that when a trait is rare, those individuals are fitter in the population. But when that trait is selected for and becomes more common, the fitness of that trait goes down, which means that the other trait in the population's fitness goes up. And then once that one becomes more common, then its fitness goes down and the other trait that you used to have comes back up. The book gives a nice example of frequency-dependent selection with this scale-eating fish with the right-mouthed versus the left-mouthed fish. And so you can read about that to see how this would work in real life. Frequently, people look at a population and they think, or an organism, and think, this seems very poorly adapted. How in the world is natural selection functioning here? It seems like that's not happening. And sometimes this gives people concerns about the ideas because they think everything should be well adapted to the environment, but that's not true. One thing is that we know that just because an allele would be useful doesn't mean that it arises. Alleles arise by mutation and other genetic changes. You can't force those to happen. Evolution is limited by historical constraints. We call evolution sort of tinkering process, where usually entirely new traits don't boom arise out of nowhere. Sometimes it seems like they do phenotypically, but they're always a building on a previously existing trait or structure or something like that. They may come together in different ways that you wouldn't have expected to cause a new phenotype to exist, but it's still dependent on things that have existed before. So this reminds me of a scenario when you're going to refurbish a house, let's say. So you have a house that already exists and you want to update it. You have to work within the constraints of that house's structure and what features it has. Sometimes that's going to mean that the outcome is not exactly what you want. Versus building a new house from scratch, basically you can make whatever happen. And evolution doesn't work like that. It's going to have to use the old existing house and then have modifications on that instead of just starting from scratch, which may mean that the new house isn't, quote, perfect. And I just want to remind you that even though we say things like evolution tinkers with this or has to do that it's really not a goal-driven process, and that the process of evolution is just a natural product of this differential survival and reproductive success, as well as these random events we've seen. So don't be misled to think that it is an entity which can control the outcome of events. Adaptations are often compromises. For example, in sexual selection, the bright males may actually be targeted more by predators, but their advantage getting mated with more often outweighs the disadvantage of getting eaten more often. So this is basically a cost-benefit kind of idea, where the adaptation is costly in some way, but the benefit of reproductive success outweighs that cost. And finally, chance, meaning genetic drift, natural selection, and the environment interact. The idea of perfect doesn't even exist, because what is adaptive in an environment depends on the environment. And if that environment shifts, and many times it's in ways that are not predictable, what was adaptive can now be non-adaptive, like the rock pocket mice, where being a sandy coat color, a light coat, was very advantageous on the sand. But if you were in a population that ended up on the lava rock, being light coat was no longer, quote, perfect, because now you're exposed to predators. And also note that genetic drift is playing a role with this chance idea here, where random events as well as catastrophes result in a population that may be poorly adapted to the environment. Make sure that you understand these 4 ideas here and have some examples to elaborate and explain each of these reasons that you're not expecting perfect organisms, even though evolution is occurring. Those are 4 of the major ways that alleles shift in populations, leading to the process we call microevolution.